Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Today we're diving into something pretty interesting. Trump versus AOC. Ideologies collide in modern America.
It's a deep dive into their contrasting views, really trying to understand how these different perspectives shape the future of America, and really highlight why it's so important to understand these differences, especially in navigating today's political landscape.
Yeah, definitely. And our source material really lays out those fundamental differences in their political philosophies and how they play out, on the issues on the hot button topics facing the country.
Exactly. So we'll be starting by examining the core tenets of, well, Donald Trump's populist nationalism and then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's progressivism.
So Trump's political philosophy. It's really characterized by a focus on national sovereignty, a big emphasis on economic protectionism, and sort of a return to traditional values.
Right, and his Make America Great Again slogan, it really encapsulates that appeal to voters who maybe felt left behind by globalization and these big cultural shifts.
Yeah, for sure. Now, in contrast, AOC's progressive stance really centers on the idea of systemic change, addressing inequality, climate change, and racial justice.
And her priorities. Key policy priorities would be the Green New Deal, Medicare for All, and that idea of redistributive taxation.
Absolutely. So next we'll get into these hypothetical debates, these clashes between Trump and AOC. We'll start with climate change.
Okay, so Trump, he prioritizes economic growth, often downplaying environmental concerns.
Right, and he withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement, which was this, big international accord to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And he also rolled back those environmental regulations, arguing, of course, that they were hindering economic growth.
Meanwhile, AOC, she champions the Green New Deal, which is this really comprehensive plan, at least in theory, for transitioning to renewable energy and, addressing this concept of climate justice.
Yeah, climate change, for her, it's an existential threat, something that demands bold action, in her view.
Right. Okay, so let's actually hear their perspectives on this. Let's hear this hypothetical debate based on what our source material lays out.
All right, so I'll be Donald Trump.
Okay, and I'll embody AOC.
Facts. I'll tell you the facts. Under my administration, we were energy independent. Gas was cheap, the economy was booming, and we didn't have to rely on countries that don't like us for oil. What you're proposing is a complete disaster.
Energy independence doesn't mean clinging to outdated, polluting industries. We need a transition, a bold one, to renewable energy. And let's talk about the cost you're ignoring, Mr. Trump. Billions in taxpayer dollars are spent annually to clean up after climate disasters. That's money we could be investing in prevention and innovation.
Innovation? You mean forcing people to drive electric cars they don't want and shutting down American factories? I've spoken to workers, Congresswoman, and they don't want your Green New Deal. It's about control, not solutions.
This isn't about control, it's about survival. Americans are already paying the price for inaction. Homes destroyed, lives lost, businesses shuttered due to extreme weather events. Your administration rolled back environmental protections, leaving communities vulnerable. How is that leadership?
Leadership is protecting American jobs, not destroying them with a fantasy agenda. You want to talk about disasters? Look at California, rolling blackouts. People can't charge their Teslas. That's your Green New Deal future.
Mr. Trump, Californians are facing blackouts because of outdated infrastructure and climate-driven heat waves. These are the very issues the Green New Deal addresses: modernizing our energy grid, investing in sustainable infrastructure, and reducing emissions. You talk about protecting jobs, but where's your plan for the future? Fossil fuels are finite, renewable energy is limitless.
My plan was energy dominance, and it worked. We had record energy production, record exports, people had jobs, affordable energy, and a thriving economy. Your plan: kill energy, kill jobs, kill America.
Energy dominance. Tell that to the families suffering from pollution-related illnesses or those rebuilding after climate disasters.
Yeah.
You can't keep ignoring the science. We need solutions, not slogans.
We don't need to move on. People need to know her plan is socialism dressed up in green. It's big government trying to run your life.
And people need to know your plan is to leave the planet burning for short-term profits. The Green New Deal is about hope and action, not fear. The real question is, what kind of world are we leaving for our children? You can really hear how different they are, how their philosophies really clash, especially on this issue.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so moving on to healthcare, another arena where they clash. Trump, He favors those market-driven solutions. He's been very opposed to single-payer health care.
Right, and he's consistently labeled it socialist, using that term, of course, pejoratively.
Exactly. AOC, on the other hand, she's advocating for Medicare for all, that single-payer system.
And she really frames healthcare as a human right, criticizing the for-profit, nature of the system we have in the U.S. right now.
Right, so let's hear another one of these hypothetical debates, this time on healthcare.
Okay, sounds good.
Oh, here we go. Another free-for-all scheme from the radical left. Folks, let me tell you something. Healthcare under my administration was the best it's ever been. Lower premiums, better choices, and none of this government takeover nonsense. People like their private insurance, and they don't want to take it away.
Mr. Trump, millions of Americans don't like their private insurance. They tolerate it because they have no other choice. Under your administration, 30 million people remained uninsured, and countless more were underinsured, forced to skip doctor visits or medications due to cost.
Nonsense. We gave people more freedom to choose. We got rid of that terrible individual mandate that forced people to buy insurance they didn't want. And we were working on replacing Obamacare with something better, something terrific. But the Democrats blocked us every step of the way.
Let's be clear. You had control of Congress and the White House, and your replacement plan never materialized. Instead, your administration tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act without a real alternative threatening coverage for millions with pre-existing conditions.
We protected pre-existing conditions. Nobody's done more to protect people with pre-existing conditions than me. And our healthcare system was working great until COVID hit, which, by the way, came from China. Not my fault.
COVID exposed just how broken our system is. Millions of Americans lost their jobs and with them, their health insurance during a public health crisis. That's why tying insurance to employment is unsustainable. Medicare for All decouples healthcare from jobs, ensuring no one is left vulnerable.
Oh, sure, Medicare for all. And how are you going to pay for it? Trillions and trillions of dollars in taxes. People won't even be able to afford their new free health care.
Mr. Trump, we already pay more per capita for healthcare than any other developed nation, yet we have worse outcomes. Medicare for All reduces costs by cutting out the middleman private insurers profiting off illness. And let's not forget, your tax cuts for the wealthy could have funded health care for millions.
Typical socialist nonsense. You want to take away people's freedom to choose, destroy innovation in medicine, and bankrupt the country. Our system is the best in the world. People come here for health care, not the other way around.
Freedom isn't having to choose between rent and life-saving medication. Freedom is knowing that if you get sick, you can get the care you need without worrying about how to pay for it. And as for innovation, public funding already drives much of the research that private companies profit from.
Oh, so now you're giving the government credit for everything. Typical. Government doesn't innovate, it regulates and ruins. You'll have bureaucrats deciding who gets what care, total disaster.
What we have now is worse. CEOs and insurance companies deciding who gets care based on profit margins. Medicare for All puts patients first, not profits. It's about dignity and equity, not bureaucracy.
Sure, let's talk about how she's going to tax everyone into oblivion.
I'd rather tax billionaires than let working families keep suffering under your trickle-down fantasy. Again, completely different views. They disagree on the role of government, individual responsibility, even the very definition of healthcare.
Exactly. Next up, economic policy. We'll start with taxation. So Trump, he implemented tax cuts, really benefiting those corporations and higher income earners.
Right, and his argument was that those cuts would stimulate growth and benefit everyone.
Right, the trickle-down theory. Now, AOC, she criticizes that approach, calling it, trickle-down economics.
Yeah, she argues that it actually worsens income inequality and doesn't actually address the needs of working families.
Right, and she proposes taxing wealth, taxing the top earners to fund social programs to reduce inequality.
Okay, so let's hear how their views on the economy really clash in this hypothetical debate.
Let me tell you, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world under my administration. Record job numbers, record stock market, and we brought manufacturing back to America. Those tax cuts, they worked. Businesses thrived, and when businesses thrive, everyone benefits. Believe me, we made America great again economically.
Mr. Trump, let's be honest, your tax cuts were a giveaway to billionaires and corporations. While Wall Street celebrated, working families struggled to make ends meet. Wages stagnated, and income inequality grew even wider under your so-called great economy.
Oh, here we go. Class warfare from the radical left. Folks, her plan, Tax hikes so big they'd scare away every business in America. You can't grow an economy by punishing success.
Punishing success. What about the families who can't afford groceries while billionaires pay less in taxes than their secretaries? My plan ensures the wealthiest pay their fair share so we can invest in infrastructure, education, and jobs for everyday Americans.
Fair share, huh? That's what they always say before they take everything. Look in Venezuela, total disaster. That's where her policies lead. Nobody wants socialism, Congresswoman.
Socialism. Let's talk about corporate socialism, Mr. Trump, like the billions in subsidies your administration handed out to fossil fuel companies. My plan isn't about handouts. It's about leveling the playing field. Raising the minimum wage, taxing billionaires, and investing in green jobs isn't radical. It's necessary.
You want to kill jobs with regulation and tax hikes. Small businesses, gone. Manufacturing, gone. People don't want your big government telling them what to do.
And under your administration, the government told workers they didn't deserve a living wage. Small businesses succeed when workers have money to spend in their communities. You handed tax cuts to corporations while everyday Americans were left to fend for themselves.
We created jobs. Millions of them. Lowest unemployment for African Americans, Hispanics, women, historic numbers. That's what we did, not your fantasyland Green New Deal economy where everyone gets taxed into poverty.
Jobs. Many of those were low-wage jobs that barely paid enough to survive. Your policies left workers vulnerable, with no safety net. My vision creates good-paying, sustainable jobs and ensures that corporations reinvest in the people who make them successful.
Oh, sustainable jobs, like wind turbine technicians. That's your big plan. People want real jobs, Congresswoman, not green pipe dreams.
People want dignity. They want to be able to support their families and retire without fear. Your trickle-down economics has failed. It's time for a bottom-up approach, an economy that works for everyone, not just the 1%. So, we see their different approaches to economic policy, their disagreements about the role of government, wealth distribution, even what a successful economy actually means.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to immigration, one of the, most contentious issues in America's politics. Trump, his focus is really on border security. He implemented those hardline policies during his presidency.
Right, and he really emphasized building that wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, those policies that ended up resulting in those family separations at the border.
Right. And AOC, she advocates for, what she calls humane immigration reform, including a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, and she criticizes Trump's approach, calling it cruel and ineffective, saying that it ignores the root causes of migration.
Right. So last debate, let's hear them on immigration.
Okay.
First of all, we need strong borders, period. Without borders, you don't have a country. My administration built hundreds of miles of wall, and it worked. Illegal crossings dropped, and we kept criminals and drugs out of this country. As for the family separations, that's on the Democrats. They refused to fix the loopholes that forced these policies. We followed the law, folks.
Mr. Trump, the law doesn't force cruelty. Separating children from their parents at the border was a deliberate choice, one that left thousands traumatized. And the border wall, a symbolic stunt that did nothing to address the root causes of migration, like poverty and violence in Central America.
Root causes. Sure. Let's just send billions to corrupt countries and hope for the best. Congresswoman, you want open borders. That's the truth. You and your party want chaos at the border.
No one wants chaos, Mr. Trump, but your policies created it. People seeking asylum were met with cages and inhumane treatment under your administration. I want an immigration system that is humane, effective, and respects international law.
Oh, humane. That's what you call letting everyone in and giving them free health care and welfare. That's not a policy. That's a disaster.
Free health care. Let me remind you that undocumented immigrants pay billions in taxes every year, contributing to our economy while receiving little in return. Humane immigration reform isn't about handouts. It's about dignity and fairness.
Fairness. What about fairness for American workers? Your policies hurt Americans the most. Cheap labor floods the market, driving wages down. I stood up for American workers. You stand up for illegal immigrants.
Standing up for immigrants doesn't mean abandoning American workers. In fact, it strengthens our economy and reflects our values. Undocumented immigrants already do essential jobs, farm work, caregiving that keep this country running. What's unfair is demonizing them for political gain.
You want to give amnesty to everyone. That's the truth. Millions of people flooding in, no vetting, no control. It's not sustainable.
And you want to build walls instead of bridges. Let's talk about sustainability, Mr. Trump. Your administration spent billions on a wall while ignoring comprehensive immigration reform that could have created pathways to citizenship, secure borders, and a more orderly process.
Pathways to citizenship. That's just code for rewarding illegal behavior. I'm for legal immigration the right way. But you want to erase the line between legal and illegal.
What I want is a system that works, a system that recognizes the humanity of those seeking safety and opportunity. Criminalizing desperate families doesn't make us safer, it makes us cruel. Real leadership means addressing the systemic issues and fixing a broken system, not scapegoating the most vulnerable.
What real leadership means is putting Americans first. My policies protected jobs, reduced crime, and kept drugs out. You want to flood the country with unchecked immigration, total chaos.
Leadership is about values, Mr. Trump. Do we value compassion, justice, and fairness? Or do we use fear and division to distract from real solutions? The choice is clear.
Thank God. I think people have heard enough of her socialism for one night.
And I think they've heard enough of your fear-mongering to last a lifetime, Mr. Trump. Again, we can really see those contrasting views on border security, the role of immigrants in society, even what it means to be American. Everything is laid bare in that exchange.
Yeah, definitely. Trump and AOC, they really do represent those opposing visions of what America's future should look like.
Absolutely, and it reflects that larger divide, that division within American society that goes beyond just these two individuals.
Exactly. It's about those fundamental values, the role of government, the direction of the country. All of that is up for debate.
So it's not just about them, it's about this bigger ideological battleground we're seeing play out in America today.
Exactly. Trump's brand of populism, that nationalist populism, really appeals to those voters looking for, I don't know, strong leadership maybe, a return to those traditional values.
Yeah.
And they often see progressivism, well, as a threat to their economic prosperity, maybe even to individual freedoms.
And on the flip side, AOC's agenda really connects with, well, it seems like younger generations, those marginalized communities. They're calling for systemic change. They want to see those issues tackled head-on. Inequality, climate change, the problems with the healthcare system.
It really highlights those bigger societal divides, the political divides that are shaping the U.S. right now.
Definitely.
I mean, you see it everywhere. Individualism versus collectivism, for example.
Yeah, or deregulation versus more government intervention.
And, of course, nationalism versus globalism. It's all playing out, whether it's legislation, cultural movements, even public opinion. It really impacts how America tries to deal with its problems.
And those ideas that they're championing, both Trump and AOC, they're going to keep having a big impact. It's going to shape the future of this country.
For sure. Okay, so let's unpack some of this a bit. Let's go deeper into these ideological currents. We'll start with populism.
Okay, yeah. Populism as an ideology, it's got a long history in the U.S.
It does. And it tends to pop up, no pun intended, during those times of, economic or social upheaval. It appeals to those who feel like the political establishment has forgotten about them.
They feel left behind.
Exactly. And typically, populist movements, they advocate for those ordinary people, right? They frame it as a fight against the elites.
Right. I mean, you can even go back to the late 19th century, the Populist Party. They were a major force. They were fighting for the interests of farmers, workers. They saw the banks, the railroads as having too much power.
Right, and their platform was really interesting. They wanted government regulation of the economy, direct election of senators, and a graduated income tax.
Big ideas.
Yeah, and even though the party itself, it didn't ultimately achieve its goals, its legacy, it did live on. It influenced those later movements.
So in the 20th century, those populist sentiments, were they more channeled into either progressive or conservative movements?
Well, they were kind of channeled into both. During the Depression, FDR, his New Deal programs, you could argue those had a populist flavor to them, expanding government's role, providing a safety net for those who were unemployed.
Okay, so both sides were tapping into that.
Yeah, and even in the 60s and 70s, you saw that populist rhetoric being used by politicians from both sides. They were trying to appeal to those voters who felt, again, like the system wasn't working for them.
And then in recent decades, we've seen this resurgence of populism, not just in the U.S., but globally.
Yeah, and I think you can really point to things like economic inequality, globalization, cultural change. It's led to, this sense of alienation, resentment among a lot of voters. And that's fertile ground for populism.
And Trump, in 2016, his campaign really tapped into those feelings.
Yeah. He did. It was a rejection of the establishment. He was in a fight for the forgotten man, the average American. A lot of his rhetoric, it really focused on economic nationalism.
Right, putting America first.
Exactly. And he really targeted immigration, too, tapping into those anxieties about, well, cultural change, national identity, that hardline stance on illegal immigration, the wall. It appealed to those voters who felt like the government wasn't protecting them.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little. Let's talk about progressivism.
Okay, yeah. So progressivism, similar to populism, it's got a complicated history in the US. It really emerged in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a response to those social and economic issues that came with industrialization and urbanization.
Things were changing rapidly.
They were. Progressive reformers, they wanted to tackle poverty, inequality, corruption, even environmental damage. They believed that the government could actually do something about these problems.
So more government involvement.
Yeah, things like labor regulations, consumer protections, environmental conservation.
And we saw some big figures pushing these ideas, right?
Definitely. Theodore Roosevelt, he championed antitrust laws, conservation efforts, and Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, these were big changes.
And they did have an impact, right? Working conditions, public health, the environment.
They did. Now, progressivism, it wasn't a single unified movement. There were different ideas about how to tackle these social problems.
Okay, so different flavors of progressivism.
Exactly. Some were more radical, advocating for socialism or some form of collectivism. Others were more moderate, wanting to work within the existing system.
But even with those internal differences, progressivism remained a force in American politics.
It did. Throughout the 20th century, the New Deal programs, the civil rights movement, even the environmental movement, they all drew inspiration from those progressive ideals.
And now, in recent decades, we're seeing a resurgence of those ideas.
We are. And a lot of it's driven by, well, the same things we talked about earlier, that economic inequality, climate change, and the push for social justice.
And AOC, she's really become a face of this new wave of progressivism.
She has. The Green New Deal, Medicare for All, tuition-free college, these are all policies that resonate with a lot of young voters.
And her focus on those social justice issues like racial equality, LGBTQ rights, it's really mobilized a new generation.
It has, and I think it shows that there's this growing feeling that, the government needs to do more to address these problems, and I think that trend is likely to continue. Climate change, automation, healthcare costs, these are all issues that aren't going away.
So besides populism and progressivism, what other ideologies are out there shaping the conversation?
Well, you've got libertarianism, for example. They emphasize individual liberty, limited government, free markets, low taxes, minimal intervention.
Okay, and what about conservatism?
Conservatism generally emphasizes traditional values, limited government as well, and individual responsibility. They often favor free markets, low taxes, and a strong national defense.
And then there's social democracy.
Right. Social democracy aims for social justice through democratic means. They advocate for a mixed economy, where the government plays a role in social welfare programs and regulates the economy.
So all these different ideas are interacting, clashing. It creates this complex political landscape.
It does. And the strength of these different ideologies, it shifts over time. Economic conditions, social trends, political events, all of these things play a role.
So understanding where these ideologies come from, how they're playing out today, that's crucial if we want to understand what's happening in American politics.
Absolutely. So let's look ahead a bit. What are the potential implications of this ideological divide? Looking at the future of American politics.
Okay, yeah. What could happen?
I think this split between populist nationalism and progressivism, it's probably going to continue. They represent these fundamentally different visions, right? America's role in the world, the relationship between the government and the individual, the best way to address these big problems we're facing.
So that divide could lead to more polarization, more gridlock.
It could. It could make compromise almost impossible. We could see more legislative stalemates, government shutdowns, and just a decline in trust in the political system.
And what about political extremism? Could this divide fuel that?
It's definitely possible. Voters become more entrenched in their own camps, more susceptible to those extreme voices. It could create a much more volatile and unpredictable political environment.
And what about the impact on foreign policy?
Well, Trump's America First approach, it could lead to more isolationism, less emphasis on global cooperation.
And AOC's progressivism, would that lead to a different approach?
Probably. It might lead to a more activist foreign policy, focused on human rights, democracy, environmental protection abroad.
So that could lead to disagreements on things like trade, military intervention, even climate change.
Absolutely. And then there's the question of American identity itself. How does this divide impact that?
Right. What does it mean to be American?
Trump's populism, it appeals to this vision of America rooted in traditional values, shared cultural heritage. But AOC's progressivism, it embraces a more inclusive, multicultural vision.
That leads to debates about things like immigration, racial equality, even the role of religion.
Exactly. The choices that we make now as policymakers, as citizens, they're going to shape the future of this country. It's crucial to have these tough conversations to try to understand different perspectives.
To find that common ground.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. The future of American democracy depends on it.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the clashing ideologies of Donald Trump and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez,
We can see their visions really do represent this, microcosm of this bigger ideological battle happening in America right now.
they have such fundamentally different philosophies, different
Yeah.
approaches to policy. Gets to the core of what it means to be American today in the
Oh.
21st century.
And our source material, it gave us that framework to understand, I think, some of the nuances of this clash. We saw those historical roots, the way their ideas actually play out in policy, and why it's so relevant right now.
Yeah. We covered a lot, from climate change
Mhm.
to healthcare, economic policy, immigration.
And we took that deeper look into populism, progressivism, and all those other ideologies that are shaping the conversation.
And it revealed a lot about the deep divisions we're seeing in society, the challenges of governing effectively in this really polarized time.
Exactly. And it shows, that the choices we make, they have profound implications, not just for us, but for the future.
The clash between Trump and AOC, it's not just about them, right? It's about these much bigger questions.
It is. It's about the fundamental questions we're all facing. What should the role of government be?
What do we owe to each other as citizens?
And what kind of future are we actually trying to build?
This deep dive, I think, has really shown us how complex, how nuanced political discourse is in America today.
It has. And more importantly, it underscores why we need to understand these competing visions that are shaping our nation.
So we encourage you to keep exploring these issues, to have those thoughtful conversations.
Even with those who, disagree with you, those opposing viewpoints.
Because by grappling with these tough issues, we can become more informed, more engaged citizens.
Exactly. And we can work towards that future, one that reflects our shared values, our shared hopes.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.